Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I'm glad to be here. I wore this t-shirt special in the hope that Mike Pence would drop in on us so we could all watch his head explode. But enough about politics. I'm glad to be here with Michael Farris Smith. I first got to know him and his writing back in 2018. I often do author events, very much like this one in Atlanta, where I live and where Salvation South is based. And I was asked if I would do a two-author event with Michael Farris Smith and another great Southern writer named David Joy, who, if you have not read him, you should. And I'll be happy to explain to you why after this is over, if you want to come talk to me. The challenge when you get asked to talk to two authors at the same time is that you have to read both books before the event. And, you know, you've got to hustle. But that was, I got to say, that was like...
I couldn't tell if you read them or not.
Well, when I did it that time, and I've not done that very often, but when I did it that time, I had an awful lot of fun reading those books 2 weeks because I discovered two writers whose work I thought was absolutely critical reading, and who I think are two of the best writers working today. And it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, because I know you're a very busy dude. And when they asked me about being in conversation, I said, how about Chuck? And then I thought, boy, Chuck gets asked to do a whole lot of stuff. So thanks for coming over. And thanks everybody for being here too, man. It's a fun day, fun time to be here. A lot to celebrate.
Well, I'm glad to be here with you. Atlanta's hot. Jackson is very hot. But I sure have had a great time being here, and I've enjoyed this festival, and I've enjoyed everyone's hospitality. For those of you who haven't read Michael's latest novel yet, it's called Salvage This World. And I will give you a brief summary of what it's about without spoiling anything. The book is set in an uncertain time in the future along the Gulf Coast when global warming has advanced to such a stage that hurricane season never ends. And if I get any of this wrong, tell me. I have read it. So.
Oh, I know.
But the region has been mostly vacated. The only folks living down here anymore are people who are too poor to leave and who are either religious nuts or criminals or both. And this book is flat one of the best books I've read all year. When I make my top 5 list, which I will not show to anybody at the end of 2023, I know it'll be on it. So let me just start by, we're going to do this for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from y'all. And just let me ask you to start with, you've written great novels with great source material, different kinds of stories. I wonder what brought you to the idea that maybe you needed to kind of look out into the future.
Yeah. Well, Salvage This World is actually a result of my first novel, Rivers, which some of you may be familiar with. And again, it's dystopian. I didn't feel like it was dystopian when I was writing it, because it really is hurricane after hurricane after hurricane, to where the government has shut down the Gulf Coast. They've drawn an imaginary boundary 90 miles across the coastline called the line. And if you stay below the line, after they make the decree, you're on your own. They're not going to try to rebuild. They're not going to service it, anything like that anymore, because the hurricanes are coming one after another, and there's not time to rebuild. People have kept asking me over the years, are you going to ever revisit that story? It feels like there could be another part to that story. It's like this world. And I did. I kept thinking about it over time. But the thing about rivers is, the very first sentence of Rivers is, it had been raining for weeks, maybe months. And the last thing I wanted to do was write a sequel to that novel where the first line was, and it's still raining. I mean, trying to write 300 pages of storms and wind and rain. I remember my editor saying, I didn't know there were so many different ways to describe rain. I'm like, yeah, I think I might have used them all. But I did love that landscape so much, and I love the nature of it so much. I thought eventually I might come to it from like a different angle. And then when I had the idea, the very first sentence of Salvage This World, there's a young woman standing staring at a storm that's coming. She's got a kid on her hip, and the wind is blowing, and the dust is whipping around. And she's just staring at that cloud, and she's imagining the storm that's coming and being able to wrestle the thunderheads. And it just kind of hit me like, well, maybe this is not post-Rivers. Maybe this is before Rivers. Like, maybe this is the creeping up toward the abandonment of the region. And we're like maybe 5-6 years away from that still. Like, the storms have become more predominant, but there's not been some mass evacuation or this mass rule that's been given. And then it kind of hit me like, I think you see this already, like this landscape in Salvage This World. I mean, all you have to do is drive across Arkansas, South Louisiana, South Mississippi, and see some of these small communities that continue to face the trauma of Mother Nature, but at the same time, like each time it's like fewer and fewer people come back, and these places are small, and there's very little infrastructure, and there's very little economy. So they're already like kind of shrinking away, right? And so it felt more realistic to me than Rivers, although I have to say Rivers did not like feel like dystopian to me. I remember the first time I was asked about writing dystopian fiction. Fortunately, it was an email interview, and I had time to look up what dystopian meant, because I wasn't 100% sure. If we'd have been doing something like this, I'd have really been in trouble. And then the other little part of that was my novels, The Fighter and Blackwood. In Blackwood, in the writing of it, characters show up in Blackwood who appeared in The Fighter. And that was an accident. Not an accident, but I was almost through Blackwood when I made the realization of who those people were, and it was like a epiphany, and I went back and wrote their story and how it connected to the opening passage of The Fighter, and I really love how those link together. So I'm like, okay, I've got this creeping up toward Rivers, and in Desperation Road, I used Pike County right down by the Mississippi-Louisiana line, and I loved writing about Pike County. So I'm like, maybe she's from Pike County. And maybe it's about 6 or 8 years before Rivers, and now we can kind of meld these two things together. And two, it wasn't a big stretch. Anybody who knows that, like kind of Kentwood, Osaka, Magnolia area, to imagine that after years and years of bad storms being like almost emptied out, that's not a difficult thing. It wasn't a difficult thing for me to imagine. I hope once you read it, you can also imagine it too. So it's not like my other novels where I almost kind of like have one image, one idea, let's go. It really, I had the first sentence of Salvage This World written for about 2 months, and it was just sitting there. And I think in the process of it just sitting there, that's when I started to consider all this other stuff. And that's kind of how. Then I sat down and started writing.
Well, one thing I want to do before I ask you a follow-up question to that is, one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to, when I read novels is, there are some writers who are brilliant storytellers, and they can spin wonderful tales and write really great plots that surprise you at every turn. But then there's another level where the craft of the writing itself just becomes so lyrical and beautiful. It's like, when you see a great painting in a museum and it grabs you so much you start looking at the brush strokes, you know. And so I'm going to read you the first sentence he's talking about because it's beautiful like that. She stood bathed in twilight, the dust in her hair and a kid on her hip, and she stared at the approaching storm as if trying to figure how to wrangle the thunderheads and steer them to a distant and parched land where desperate souls would pay whatever ransom she demanded. That's good, right?
That's not bad.
Not bad at all. Y'all give him a hand.
Thank you.
But, you know, one of you just said something that we haven't talked about before, which is that there are actually physical settings that now feel like that abandonment has already happened.
Yeah. It's funny, when Salvage This World came out, I started getting like messages from people who like live in some of these places. And they said, this feels so close to like my community.
Really?
In my area. And it was like from Arkansas, it's from Louisiana, it was from Mississippi, it was from Alabama. Like, and it was, I mean, it was sad to hear that. You know, I'm making it up, but I also feel like it's what I see, and in ways like almost what I anticipate. But I do think it's a lot closer to what you can see. And the messages I got from people who said this feels really almost like the place I live. It was, I mean, it's kind of depressing and sad, but it's also made me feel that I had depicted it the right way. Because I always want to push the boundary of whatever it is. In this moment, it was the landscape, and of course the characters too. But you want to kind of push it to the extremes without making it seem unrealistic or cartoon-like. You want to keep it grounded in that reality to where the reader feels like they can walk right through this place. And the response I got from people who live in communities like this seemed to back that up the way the novel felt to me. I think it must have felt the same way to them.
Well, I think it's an important function of art to try to point to, to describe and depict realities that everybody maybe is uncomfortable looking at.
Right.
But
right.
You need to look at them if you want to know the truth of your world.
That's true. And for me, one of the greatest compliments I ever get in a review or as a writer is that it will say something to the effect that the way I'm looking at the world is unflinching. And I think that's how we have to look at it. Unflinching. And I think that's how we have to look at it. And that's how we need to look at it.
Well, it's so funny that you use that word, because when you started talking about the physical places where people in this situation live, it made me think about a project I'm working on now with a photographer that we're going to publish in Salvation South in advance of his book coming out. His name's Benjamin Dimmitt, and he's grew up in Florida. And since 2006, he's been photographing the same swamp from the same vantage points. It's about 60 miles north of Tampa on the Gulf Coast. And the photographs are chilling.
I bet.
Like there's this one picture where you're looking over the water, and across the water it looks like just lush jungle with like cypress knees coming out in the water, and all that. And that's from 2006, and the same photograph from the same vantage point in 2022. The trees are just like bare sticks sticking up.
And I would venture to say most people in this room have had this experience of the place they are from or place they know, and you go back through it 10, 15, 20 years later, and it's just a shell of itself. I would guess a lot of people in this room have had that experience,
Yeah. And he named his book An Unflinching Look.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He should.
Well, one of the things that you look at kind of unflinchingly is the way that religion sometimes gets used to manipulate people, as opposed to give people comfort and solace. And you have a character in this book, a woman preacher named Elster. who is, why don't you describe her?
Elser. Well, you get in a point in any writing experience where you're like, okay, it's time to bring somebody new into this. And what's more fun than a traveling tent revival in the rundown South with a storm coming, you know? And so, believe it or not, I named this traveling carnival the Temple of Pain and Glory, and that was the very first title I had for it. It just popped out. I'm like, Temple of Pain and Glory. That's perfect, you know? And I knew then this is going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be probably fairly heartbreaking for what this thing is about to do. And like, you know, I'm not the first person to write a tent revival in a Southern novel, certainly. However, I wanted to stay away from the stereotype of like who might be leading this thing. I'm like, how do you make the leader of this thing different? So she can't hear this, and I'm certain she's not watching on Instagram. My literary agent is she's probably between 65 and 70, I would guess. And she is 5'1", and she weighs about 87 pounds, and she scares the living shit out of everybody. Like, she is, like, all I ever have to do when I'm dealing with somebody and it's going a little awry, I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to tell Ellen to call you. And they're like, no, that's okay, we got it covered, we'll take care of it. Because nobody wants to get a phone call from Ellen. So in my mind, I was like, okay, Elser, I don't even know where I got that name. It just sounded like a good old hellfire and brimstone Southern name, Elser. But I'm like, she's going to be like Ellen. She's going to be 5 feet tall, skinny as a rail. You can pick her up and put her in your pocket, but she's going to be the intimidating factor that drives this thing. And she is. And it made it a challenge to do it, first of all, because taking some of that stature, which is becoming more and more a world of like the physical, like this, where the strongest get what they want, right? And here she is just driving the train, man, of the Temple of Pain and Glory. And to her and for me in the writing of it, the joy and the interest and even the curiosity of it was, how does she do it? You know, how does she manipulate? How does she get people to do what she wants? How does she get the money out of the pocket and into the wicker basket at the end of the tent revival? What is she saying? How does she preach? How does she deliver her message? And how does she keep this thing going, you know? And she's scary, dude. Like, she's like Ellen. She's scary. Nobody wants to mess with her. But I pictured a chain-smoking, 85-pound senior citizen who would just kick your ass, you know? And I think that's, by and large, what we got. But the joy of writing, and the thing I really loved writing about her, too, is watching her evolve and watching her sermon evolve to continue to get what she needed out of the people that she's taking advantage of. Because there's a moment in the novel, some of you have read it, some of you haven't, when her sermon changes from one message into another, and it really pushes things forward in the way that I love to just push things forward and make them really challenging and intense, and to have that moment come out of her mouth.
Well, and as you get to know her through the book, I mean, that's kind of foreshadowed. You're like, this can't come to any good because it's not. Yeah. It's like, okay, let me read you a little piece here. No storm could deter the Temple of Pain and Glory. Elser and her crew would ride out the hurricane in some strip of motel rooms outside of Faraday or Tylertown, playing cards and smoking anything they could find to smoke, and drinking and sleeping and joining hands in hungover prayer when it felt like the motel might get clobbered. On the back end of the storms, the sun always shined, sometimes for weeks. Bright blue days with a high sun and high temps, and Elser would get them all back into the vehicles and they would hit the road. And it struck me too that the lead vehicle in the caravan is a hearse.
Yeah. I mean, why not?
That's as good an answer as any, I reckon. One of the things that struck me really hard about the book, because I think you pulled this off, really brilliantly is the pacing of the story. Unlike almost any other thing I've ever read, this book to me, when I read it, it felt like it got faster and faster and faster all the time. Like, you know, it does. It starts off on that porch with this woman holding her child in her arms and, you know, watching the storm clouds rise and, you know, which is kind of a, I mean, there's foreboding in it, but there's also, I mean, who doesn't like to stand on their porch and watch a thunderstorm, you know? But this thing just, I told somebody when I was trying to convince them to read the book that, you know, when I read it, it felt like it had grabbed me by the hair of the head and was dragging me forward.
That's nice. I mean, kind of.
In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. Well, thank you. That's very nice to say. And there's a propulsion in this that came from the very first page that I felt like I had to earn, and I think maybe has something to do with the momentum. Is like, if he would have kept reading the first chapter, Jesse has to take off running from this house from watching the storm.
You might want to tell them who Jesse is real quick.
Jesse is the 21-year-old main character of the story, and she's got her little young child, Jace, on her hip. And she's running around with the wrong dude, running around with the wrong people, but they are on the run, almost in hiding, and he's disappeared from them for a few days, and she's without a vehicle, she's without anything, she's largely abandoned. And as she's staring at the storm, all of a sudden these headlights start coming up this long gravel driveway where they have this cabin back, and she knows it's trouble, and it is trouble, and she has to grab the child and take off running, and she runs through the house. And as she's running through the house, she's grabbing what you would grab when you know you're about to run for your life. Whatever money there was, there's a pistol laying on the bed. She grabs it. And then, in the writing of the sentence of the thing she's grabbing, I wrote, and she grabbed the key. She opened the drawer and grabbed the keys that he told her to grab if you ever have to run. And that was just in passing. And then it hit me as this story grew into 2 chapters and 3 chapters. Like, what in God's name are these keys? The keys to it. And I either need to have a hole in her pocket and she's got to lose them, or I got to keep carrying them around and figure out what they are too, you know? So I decided to carry them around. And the further I got down this novel, I got to about page 200. I was going, man, these keys better lead to something really damn good, or else I got to throw this whole thing out and start over, like truly. And so I was going in that direction, I think, from the beginning without ever really knowing it, you know, like. And I think that's the wonderful thing about the creative process, when she just grabs those keys and the words come out of you. The keys he told her to grab if you ever had to make a run for it, stuck them in her pocket, and then 200 pages later, you're sitting there going, holy shit, what am I going to do with these keys? And what do they lead to? Because as the story goes, they get bigger and bigger.
They do.
And then Holt shows up, and he wants to know, did you get the keys? And I'm sitting there going, oh my God. So that's where we were going. And I think maybe that's why, because it felt really like forward falling to me too, because I knew we had to get to whatever those keys belong to, and then what? And then it's got to be really cool, whatever it is, or what? Yeah.
Well, the keys do become this kind of talisman in the book. You know, they're like. I mean, it happened to me as a reader too. Mm-hmm. You get to the point where she grabs those things, and it's like that line, the keys he told her to grab.
Yeah.
You know,
I wouldn't recommend it.
No, but I was like, what's up with those keys? You know, and I knew I would have to think of the keys almost as a character in the book. And you know, it's that's an interesting thing to me, you know, because like the way you talk about how you wrote that, it wasn't like some grand plan.
No, it was not some grand plan. I've worked without a net in writing novels. It's a day-to-day thing. I never look too far ahead, never plan too far ahead. And I'm serious, I was getting really nervous about these keys. And in like one of the first interviews after the book came out, like the second question was, when did you know what those keys were the keys to? I said, the second you knew what they were, that was the day and the moment I knew what they were. And that's not a lie. And I was so relieved. I was like, thank God. I made it with the keys, and I think it works.
Writers continually surprise me with stories like that. The first night I met Michael, when I had gotten really enamored with the first sentence of the other guy's book, David Joy, because it was a hell of a first sentence. I've never forgotten it. Aiden McCall was 12 years old the one time he heard I love you. And I was like, whoa. And so I asked David, and I thought it would be a brilliant question because I figured that he had to work so hard to get to that sentence and to figure out it should be the very first sentence of the book. And so I asked him that, and he said, well, this is the first sentence I wrote.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that continually amazes me when I interview novelists is that things just happen.
They do, and like the first sentence that I told you of this novel that I had sitting around for 2 months, like I'm fairly certain I said it. I was sitting at a coffee shop or somewhere, and I was just thinking about it, and this image came, and I just pulled out my phone on notes, and I wrote it. And I just left it there, and I kept looking at it. I'm like, that's a pretty good sentence. And then I would read it the next day, and then I'm like, and it felt like there was a lot in there, like there was a lot to unpack, and then, I mean, the way I wrote it that day is the way it is in the novel, you know.
I've got a first sentence I want to read y'all, and if you recognize it, raise your hand. It's not his. From a little after 2 o'clock until almost sundown of the long, still, hot, weary, dead September afternoon, they sat in what Miss Coldfield still called the office because her father had called it that, a dim, hot, airless room with the blinds all closed and fastened for 43 summers, because when she was a girl, someone had believed that light moving air carried heat and that dark was always cooler. And I won't finish.
I think some people know.
Absalom, y'all are right. And, you know, that sentence is 124 words long and it only has one comma in it. The first sentence of Salvage This World is 50 words long and only has one comma in it.
It does have one?
Yeah, sorry, dude.
That was a mistake.
You know, and that's the next thing I want to talk about is how you've developed this strong aversion to the comma. There are...
I really like, most people want to ask me about my style. And Chuck's just like, why don't you like the comma? Well,
she stood in the twilight, comma.
She stood bathed in twilight, comma.
She stood bathed in twilight, comma.
I would have had it to do over. I would take that out.
I kind of figured that.
Well, what you just read has had a big influence on my writing life. William Faulkner. Reading him. Reading Cormac McCarthy had a big influence on my writing life. Reading William Gay had a big influence on my writing life. Hemingway. Now, these aren't writers who were in love with punctuation. And there's something about reading those writers that was very lyrical to me. When you're not... And I think your sentences should have a lyrical quality, or at least I want my sentences to have a lyrical quality. I feel like my upbringing as a Southern Baptist kid, being in church, and my mom played the piano, and from the time I was big enough to stand up, I stood in the choir. Mm-hmm. And so I was constantly around gospel music, and I really think that the music and the lyricism and the images of all the gospel music too, like really saturated into me, that when I did finally sit down and start writing, there was something lyrical in it that punctuation didn't really help.
Right.
You know what I mean? and that the compounds that run-on sentences did help, and fragments do help. Because the only reason I know this is because somebody wrote an article about the style of this novel, and they talked about the first sentence being this lovely long run-on sentence, and the second sentence is how long? Can you pull that up?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
Yeah, they're like
acres of sugar cane cut to nubs surrounding the house.
They were like the first sentence is this long run-on sentence, and the second sentence is a short fragment.
Right.
Like, where, like, I don't know, like, you don't think about that ever. I've never once written a sentence and thought, well, that's a fragment. I'm just like, I like the way it sounds, and I like the way it feels, and I think that's what art and writing is supposed to be. It's supposed to be instinctive, and these are just like the instincts I follow based on, my experiences, things I've heard, the influence of music, the writers that I read. Another idea of writing that I had in my head and reading the Expatriates was Ezra Pound, the expatriate poet who had the School of Imagism, is what he called it. He had three rules for Imagism, and it was direct treatment of the subject, whatever that is. In other words, hit the image. Use no word that doesn't contribute, and compose lyrically. And that has been like almost my mantra in writing for the last 20 years. Like that really, I really understood that for some reason. And then I'm reading the writers who are they are very lyrical, and I think in just over time of the writing, and everybody who sits down to write has their own style, just based on who they are, where they're from, what they've listened to, who they've read, et cetera, and my style just happens to be this style, and I've become very comfortable with it. And I remember the first, so when you get down to the copy edit with a manuscript, that's when somebody's checking for all your punctuation and this and that and the other. And Rivers was with Simon & Schuster. I don't really remember that, but I moved over to Little Brown, and it's been 5 novels with them. And I remember when I got my Desperation Road copy edit back, it had about 14,000 commas added. And I started circling them and writing stet to take them out, right? And after about the 3rd page, I just kind of skimmed through it. And I just wrote a note. I said, please remove every added comma. And they did it. I think we argued over 20 of them.
Yeah.
Because this was a copy editor, and that was her, the job. When I got the copy edit, what was next? For The Fighter, there was about 200 added commas. And I think I even gave them a few. When I got the copy edit for Blackwood, there were 4. It was the same copy editor every time. So she has adapted and gone along with me and sees what I'm done. And when I got the copy edit for Salvage This World, there were 2 commas added. And with both of them, she had written a note out to the side and said, is this okay? And I let her have both of them. I was like, yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it.
Well, I tell you what, when I do finally get started on the novel that I think is in my head, I'm probably going to bug the shit out of you. With the same question how do I get all these commas out? Because it's interesting, when you do the work I've done, editing other people's work for so many years, you become a slave to style books, and dictionary, and you're like, well, that clause is dependent, therefore there must be a comma.
Yeah.
And,
I see where they're
But the thing about it is the lyricism, though.
Yeah,
if somebody can write lyrically,
right.
You have to let them. And you just told me something interesting that I think we have in common but have never talked about, which is, your mom played piano in a little Baptist church. Mm-hmm. See, my dad was choir director.
Oh, yeah.
In a little Baptist church. He was the one who, told, Brother Oscar, now it's your turn to stand up and lead the song. Yeah. And he's the one who bought the song books every year, and so we both grew up in that, and my mom was, like, she had a beautiful alto voice.
Yeah.
She died when I was only 11, and I couldn't remember her voice for the longest time. And then, 40 years later, when Dad was getting up in his 80s, he actually, before I was born, they sang in a quartet together.
Oh, really?
And he found in the closet a reel-to-reel one-track tape of that they had recorded 10 songs in 1957.
Wow, that's awesome.
And he had an audio engineer friend who cleaned it up and sent it to me, and I was like, of course that's what Mama sounds like.
Yeah, that's lovely.
I wrote a story about that. If y'all want to read it, just Google Lost Voice, Bitter Southerner. I wrote it the first year on Thanksgiving because I was like, we don't have a Thanksgiving story out like this. And but that's, you grow up in that. You grow up in that musical environment. It's when you read prose, you really wanna, you wanna hear music in it.
I think so. I mean, I do. And people ask me if I read my stuff out loud, but I don't. I think it's just, and I do just think it's the influence of music, of having that thing in my head, where I just don't do that. I don't really know how to explain it, and I don't want to try to because I'm afraid it'll go away. If you do, try to define it, but I love that I have an editor who turns me loose to be me.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And with a lot of periods and dashes and commas and things like that, it wouldn't sound the same. It wouldn't feel the same. It wouldn't have the same propulsion. Like the propulsion you're talking about, it wouldn't have the same propulsion and momentum. And there's a tremendous power in like a 4-word fragment. If you can hit it and land it in the right spot. I mean, you can knock somebody out, and I love it when I have one of those things that I think is really important. You got this long paragraph, and you just make it its own little 4-word line. And it's like...
Sometimes that, very small word choice can change everything.
Well, I can give you a very good example of this in Salvage This World. Jessie she's on the run. She's got the kid on her hip. She ends up at this payphone after running through the woods for the night. This is not spoilers. This is first 2 chapters. I mean, we're out of the gate with our hair on fire. And she's standing at this payphone, and she doesn't know what to do, and she doesn't know who to call. And through this, you've realized she hasn't been home. She hasn't seen her father in several years, and you know that it's something not cool has happened between them. And she's standing there looking at that payphone, and she's pacing back and forth. She doesn't know what to do. And then she just walks over and drops a quarter and picks up the phone and calls home. And then the start of the next chapter, Wade's sitting there by himself. He's got his own problems. And it's a landline. Do y'all remember having a landline when it would ring and you could just look at it and you didn't know who it was or where they were calling from? And they didn't know if you were there or not, which made it even better. And you didn't have to answer. And this phone starts ringing and Wade's just sitting there looking at it, not having no idea it's her on the other end. And it rings, and it stops. And he sits there for a minute. We've all experienced it too. And it starts ringing again, and you know it's the same person. It starts ringing again, and finally, he doesn't want to, but he's just picks it up. And when he picks it up, the voice on the other end says, Daddy. And that changed the entire novel for me, because I knew right at that moment it was going to be about a father and a daughter. Because she doesn't say Wade. She doesn't say hey. She doesn't say dad. What does she say? She says daddy. And we all know that has a very different connotation. And in that moment, hearing her voice for the first time in 2 or 3 years, and he's mad at her, when she says daddy, he lets it all fall in that moment. And he's like, what do you need? She's like, I need to come home. He goes, okay. If she'd have said anything else, they would have started arguing. But I remember it was like the keys. When she said the word daddy, that surprised me, and I thought, okay, that just, I think, really changed the dynamic of what this is going to be. And it did. And it was just one word.
It's like the first verse of the old hymn going by so fast, and then the chorus comes and it's, I'll fly away.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's right in your face. Now that I've discovered this about us, it's something we're going to have to talk about for hours.
Oh, Lord. We're going to have to be sitting at a bar to do it, though.
That's all right. That's all right. But I have to ask you one question, just because I'm curious. What's the one hymn from your childhood that won't leave your head?
Well, Amazing Grace has always been like the song I sing in my head from time to time. But when I was a kid, Victory in Jesus was for some reason my favorite hymn.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all know that one?
Sing a little bit.
I'll Fly Away is a beautiful, wonderful song. The Old Rugged Cross, too, is something that always kind of stuck with me.
Yeah.
There's something very macabre about that hymn. And about most Sunday school stories in general, but yeah.
Well, you know, Amazing Grace, like, do y'all know the story of Amazing Grace? Who wrote it? And why? His name is Newton, and he was a slaver, sailed slave ships from the Caribbean and Africa to America. And one day, he had an epiphany that it was wrong. And he sold his ship, and he wrote the song. Was blind, but now I see. Once I learned that story, I was like, okay, favorite song forever.
Yeah, really, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's a whole documentary about that.
Yeah.
Another thing that Michael does in this book that I think contributes to the lyricism of it is he's also developed an aversion to the hyphen. There are repeated instances of adjectives that are two words smashed together. One that I really like is hard-looking. She was a hard-looking woman.
Yeah, one word.
Yeah. Another one is deep drunk.
Deep drunk?
Deep drunk.
That's a good one.
A deep drunk night.
Deep drunk night, yeah.
I mean, was that something you did on purpose, or did you just find yourself doing it? Because there's a bunch of those in the book.
Well, I think it's kind of unknowingly on purpose, you know. Yeah, I'm not much a fan of hyphens either. I mean, I think when I look at it, it looks like poetry to me.
Yeah.
It's a strong image. And I know maybe a hyphen wouldn't matter that or not, I don't know. But like deep drunk and dusk blue, that's one of my favorite ones when dusk blue is together. And I don't know, it's just been an evolution of the way it comes out, and I have not bothered to go back and put hyphens in for the sake of the MLA handbook, and nobody's asked me to.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you write on a typewriter?
A laptop.
You must have autocorrect turned
Oh,
off.
I have to turn it off. Yeah, I haven't had autocorrect on for about 15 years.
Because I was making my notes
Yeah.
to ask you questions, and I tried to write deep drunk and hard looking. Didn't want to let me.
Yeah.
Who out there's got questions? Just raise your hand and speak very loudly, because we don't have a mic out there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so you talk a lot about place in a lot of your books, and being from South Mississippi as well, I understand that it's kind of this fertile place as well. You get the Ward visits it, Natasha Trethewey visits it. And you do it in such a dexterous way. I'm wondering how exactly do you mine place, being from Southwest Mississippi, and how you kind of breathe life into your novels through that?
How do I do what? Mine? Is that what you mean?
Mine.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I would say about the time I started having some success, one of the reasons was I decided to start using places I know. A couple of failed novels that are in landfills somewhere, because I've lived a lot of different places, particularly like moving around a lot as a kid as a preacher, I would like be hodgepodging several different places together to make some fictional place, and it was always just was kind of clunky, and I didn't ever feel like I was really rooting into it. And it finally just hit me like, why don't you just write about a place you know? Because you know the swamp, you know the hills, you know the way the sun sets, you know the names of the streets, so you don't have to spend your time on Google trying to figure that stuff out. Like, you know the way the church bell sounds, like you know all these things. And that really, I mean, that was kind of an epiphany, because I felt like, okay, you've just taken a level of anxiety out of this thing that you had before in trying to create this whole world. And I mean, you know, from reading them, and because of the writers I do admire, I really love it when character is its own place. So if I'm going to sink into Pike County, I like really want to sink into it. And I think that has a lot to do with my characters being moving too, you know, like when Russell's riding around in Desperation Road on those back roads, that's me riding around in Pike County. When Jack Boucher's driving through the Delta in the middle of the night in the fighter, that's me, you know, driving through the Delta. And same thing for, you know, other things. I feel like my characters are moving. For me, that's, I guess, is a way as a writer to kind of see more of the place, you know. But I do think if you're going to write about a place, then just go all the way in on it. Like, don't half-ass it. Don't be afraid to just like indulge, because every place is interesting. It doesn't matter where it is. Every place is. Your living room is interesting in some way. I wouldn't suggest writing a novel about it, but just really soak into it, you know. And if you're from down there, like, you know, it's different in the morning than it is in the afternoon than it is at twilight, you know, and it has that feel. And I do love that about it. And I just love just immersing myself into wherever it is. Yes.
Michael, I went to South Pike, and my little sister went to Park Lane, and we still have our home in Pike County, so I know all the places you're talking about. But I'm curious who first exposed you to Faulkner in any way in Pike County, or after that, the writers, I'm a writer too, but the writers that influenced you most?
Well, I didn't get into this till later. I didn't start writing till I was about 29 or 30. And what happened in my 20s is I ended up living abroad for several years. And I was not a good student in high school or college. I just didn't I didn't care. And so I was just trying to graduate, which I barely managed to do. When I was living abroad, I started noticing people on the trains and in the cafes and sitting in the parks reading. And I had language gaps, and even like I couldn't just watch television. So for the first time in my life, I said, well, I'll try that. I'm going to start reading to fill some time. I mean, I laugh too because it sounds ridiculous, but that was the exact thought I had. So when I would, be in Paris or Geneva or whatever, I would try to find a little English language bookstore, and I would go buy some books. And because I barely, wasn't a good student, the only names I knew to read were the big names. Like anybody who went to high school would know, like, the big names. So I bought Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Charles Dickens and Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner, because I remember thinking, like, well, I'm from Mississippi, maybe I should probably read Faulkner. And the very first Faulkner I found at a little bookstore in Geneva, Switzerland was Absalom, Absalom. And I remember pulling out and going, well, that's not very big, I'll do that one.
You started hard.
And I was like, what is going on? Like, I don't get it.
Long, dead, hot,
Man.
dreary.
So somehow I got through the end of it. But I remember thinking, even though I was as lost as a person could be, I remember thinking there's something like unique about this stuff, like in the sentences like that. But so that it turns out those writers are pretty good writers to read. So that's how I cut my teeth on becoming a reader for pleasure. And it was several years of that, reading for pleasure and reading. And the other thing too, and this was weird, being from Mississippi, like I've talked about the Southern writers who have influenced me, certainly. But my very first influences were the expatriates, because I was living abroad. When I started reading Hemingway, and his characters were sitting at the cafes in Paris, and I was sitting at the cafes in Paris. And his characters were going to the bullfights in Spain, and I was going to the bullfights in Spain. Like, you know how it is when you read something and you relate to it, and it like seems to make sense. I had to go to another continent, far, far, far away from home, to start reading, and Fitzgerald too, to start reading something that I could like almost in some weird way relate to. you know. Plus, I was an expatriate. So that feeling of wanderlust and bewilderment, and I think loneliness and isolation that you get from those writers too, I could relate to that. And it was after years of reading that, I came home. I remember I came home to Mississippi one Christmas, and I was home for a few weeks, and I had some friends in Oxford, and I went up there and I walked in Square Books one night. And I walked to the Mississippi Writers table, and I thought, okay, Faulkner, I don't know that I can do that anymore. Like, I got to find somebody else from Mississippi to read. And fortunately, it was a contemporary Mississippi Writers table, and I picked up a story collection called Big Bad Love by Larry Brown and a novella Ray by Barry Hannah. And I walked out that night, and I went down, sat on the porch, and I read both of those books from beginning to end that night before I went to bed, because they hit me right between the eyes, because I'm like, this is what a writer living and breathing in Mississippi today is writing about, and this is how they're doing it. God bless Faulkner, I do love him, but that was an important lesson for me. And that was my introduction to Mississippi and Southern writers, because I've also talked a lot about the influence Larry had on my writing life. In reading his interviews, all the failure he went through, and he was 29 when he started, and he was kind of a blue-collar guy. He just loved reading, and he just decided he wanted to try. Like, that was becoming my story, and I could relate to it. And also, he was talking about Charles Bukowski and Cormac McCarthy and Flannery O'Connor, and that's how I got introduced, and Harry Crews, and that's how I got introduced to those writers and reading his interviews. So that's maybe an answer to your question. But that's how my reading life led to my writing life, and how I became influenced by the writers I was influenced by.
That thing of hearing or reading writers' stories about things you know in your own life is really, really important. The woman, Marianne Leake, who her first published piece of fiction is the lead story this weekend in Salvation South. It'll be up on the homepage tomorrow. And she's a retired school teacher in a little bitty town in North Carolina called Hayesville. And I remember years ago, she told me a story when she was teaching. She had an English class, and she just couldn't get the kids interested. That, you know, they're twiddling their thumbs or their phones or whatever kids were twiddling 10 years ago. And then she started assigning them stories by people like Ron Rash, who wrote about that geography that the kids lived in. And suddenly it was like a light bulb went on, and they got all curious, and she wound up inviting Ron Rash to come visit her classes, and he did, and you know, it just sparked this. And it's so funny because the first comment when we published a sneak peek of her story was from one of her former students about how she related to the places that Marianne had written about her.
That's what Big Bad Love did for me in Larry's stories. When his the back roads they were riding on and smoking cigarettes on and doing whatever they were doing, I'm like, I know these people. And I know this place. I mean, it's North Mississippi Hill Country, but we did the same thing in Pike County. Like, I know these people, and I know I can hear their voices, and I can see the landscape. And it really hit me like, well, maybe if you wanted to write, you probably have plenty to write about because it's there. You know, it's just a matter of mining it. I'll borrow that word from now on.
I did have a scary experience with that one time, though, because I grew up in Gilmer County, Georgia, and when I got assigned the collected poems of James Dickey, and in a Southern literature class, the first poem in the book was May Day Sermon by a Woman Preacher to the Women of Gilmer County.
Yeah.
Scared the hell out of me.
I bet.
Who else has a question? Yes, ma'am.
I haven't gotten to read this book yet, but as you're talking, and I've read the other things, Nick is an anomaly. Talk about how you came to do Nick.
How much time is left? Seriously.
5 minutes.
Okay, how did I come to do Nick? I'm going to think so I can give you the really quick version. Published Rivers. I was having some problems with my publisher, even though that book got a wonderful acclaim, made a ton of lists. I gave them Desperation Road, and they shrugged their shoulders. They were not interested. Well, I don't know. It's funny. I remember the comment from my editor's boss was, I just don't think Desperation Road is going to move the needle. And when it comes out in theaters on October the 6th, I'm going to send her an email and say, I hope that fucking moved the needle. Sorry, I got mad for a second. All right, back to the story. So I was in a pretty bad spot. I was also had to fire my agent at that same time. So I was like, I've done all this. I've broken through. It took me 10 years, and I'm sitting out here on an island. Nobody wants me. Nobody cares. I don't have an agent. And I was in my house one day, aggravated, and I was like, I need to read something. I just need to flush my system and read something. And Gatsby was sitting on the shelf. I hadn't read it in 15 years. And I'd largely forgotten about it. Couldn't remember anything of it, but it's short. And I'm like, well, I'm going to read something short. And I sat down and started reading. And I'd read it twice in my life, and I really didn't think much about it either time. But as I started to read it this time, after having become a writer and lived as an expatriate and all these things, it was like almost every page there was something that I could feel, and it was really speaking to me. And also, as a more advanced reader now, the lyricism of all that was like blowing me away. It was so like beautiful in some places. And I kept going, and I got to the end of the book where Nick is forgotten it's his birthday. And he's about to be 30. He remembers it's his birthday all of a sudden. That he's about to be, and not just a birthday, but 30. You know those decade birthdays are bigger. And I thought, how could you be so detached that you don't even know it's your own birthday? And it's a big birthday. And then the sentence after that, he says, he was staring at a decade of loneliness. And that's the sentence that, because as soon as I read that sentence, I was in a really bad spot. I was in a really depressed spot. I realized what all I'd come through to, I thought, get somewhere, and it wasn't, and I was going in the opposite direction. It hit me how I was 29 years old when I came back from Europe. I'd been gone from home for a long time. The people I knew had gotten married, had kids, gotten jobs, bought houses, and I had a duffel bag on my back and was sleeping on people's couches deciding to write, whatever the hell that meant. And I can remember thinking, I'm about to be 30, and look at everybody else, and look at me. And I'm like, this is either going to be real bad, go real bad, or it's going to somehow work out. But either way, I'm about to jump in here and try it. And I fully anticipated a decade of loneliness and failure, to be honest. And that sentence hit me right between the eyes. And I finished the book, and I laid it down. And I got up, and I was just kind of walking around, and I'm like, God, what makes that guy so like detached and like so isolated and lonely? And I thought it'd be really cool if somebody wrote his story. And then that was it. I was like, well, you're a novelist. Why don't you do it? You clearly feel it. And so that's how that novel came to be. And I wrote it in complete silence. I didn't tell. She was the only person who knew I was doing it. Because I knew if I told anybody what I was doing, they would tell me I was batshit crazy. And so when I did get a new agent, and we were ready to move ahead again with Desperation Road, I said, she goes like, do you have anything else? I'm like, yeah. What? Prequel to The Great Gatsby. What? And so that's how we came to get Nick. Yeah.
Thank y'all so much. You've been a great audience, and obviously some of you know already that Michael has pulled off the rare feat of having two of his books turned into movies that are going to be released within 5 weeks of each other, starting on October 6th with Desperation Road and ending on November 10th with the movie based on his book, The Fighter, which is called Rumble Through the Dark. And he pulled off the amazing feat that's quite rare for novelists of being hired to write the scripts for both those movies. So you guys, we're all lucky to know this man.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.